Well, welcome. It's the May Simulcast. So glad you guys are on. And we're looking at the content today of that we've been actually building on every month for the last 5 months. I was watching a basketball game the season before last, and the University of Alabama had three players, and they had three guys against five guys. The situation got to where they couldn't have five guys on the court. Won't go into the details, but as you watch those three guys ferociously play, they hung in there. They were actually winning against a team of five, which you're sitting there going, I can't believe this. They're actually they may win. They may win, but the inevitable happened, right? They didn't win because there's just no way three can beat five in the length of the game. You may have a spurt and you may look like you're doing great, may look like you're killing it, but you won't kill it for long. And you may be deceived to think that that event is going to actually be something you can achieve and win. Why did I start with that illustration? Because in ministry and what Jesus has called us to do, um, we really have a similar situation where we're going to need to share a screen, Tyler, here in a minute. So if you could give me the screen share ability there. What we're going to do is we have this process where we've got two pieces that come together: the scattered church and the gathered church. And Hugh Halter is the one who gave us that language and that concept. And here's an image that we just came up with for us to discuss, and that's this idea here: is that really it's the idea of the effect the New Testament. I just want to just jump started, and then I want you guys to begin to discuss this. So here's just the real quick content that it actually came from our time. I was talking with Kevin, and out of our conversation, we were discussing this idea that, well, the gathered church is where a lot of us spend our time, and but at least where we've come from is the gathered church, and the gathered church is usually led by shepherds, teachers, and prophets. And the shepherds can become territorial. The teachers can become apathetic and prideful. They don't mean to be, but this has happens when they're disconnected from the overall mission of the scattered church. And the prophets, they can have power and abuse. We've all seen situations where prophetic people begin to use their prophetic position. Shepherds become territorial. We don't want you to plant any churches in our area. We're hanging on to our people. Don't go to that other church. Teachers can become apathetic, where they just think that the only thing that is important is teaching the scriptures and theology and doctrine. They can become prideful. We've all seen situations where that happens. And what happens is there's a couple of things. There's some positive qualities there. It can give you stability and security. It can give you equipping center, training and support. And it can also produce negative qualities like rigidity and legalism. So I just want to just kind of lay this out real quickly. And then many of us have been focused on the scattered church. And oftentimes you get to the scattered church because, well, we've been in this whole process of the scattered church. And there's some challenges that the scattered church brings. And we're going to talk about those, but I just wanted to just break this down real quickly so we can begin to lay this out and discuss this idea. And what we're looking at is this, going back to the idea of this gathered church. One of the things that we have a tendency to deal with is the gathered church oftentimes has some qualities that are challenging. And so if you look at the gathered church, well, I'm not trying to bring this up anyway. So as we were talking about this idea, especially Kevin and Carlene and myself, so as we think about this idea of this chaotic movement, the first thing we discussed is this idea of the shepherd can be territorial, the teacher can be apathetic, and the prophet can be prideful. We've all seen examples of that, haven't we? When that occurs, and we're not saying that to be critical. We're just saying that those are some qualities that emerge, and that we have to be paying attention to. And so, as we do that, we've got a couple of breakout questions I want us to discuss, because what happens when the gathered church misses their perspective. And I just want, if you look on the notes, the very first part of the gathered church, I'll just use my paper notes. What happens is the outreach movement of the gathered church oftentimes is that the purpose is to maintain a legacy, to have a place for my family, to care for our own, to become larger, to spread the brand. And the outreach movement of the gathered church oftentimes is, well, the local church expands by having division over worship preferences. We've all seen divisions that happen where we want traditional, we want contemporary, we want a blended service, or the unresolved conflict piece where there's a split in the division in the church, and so they actually reproduce new churches, but out of a negative position. Or you've got the denominational engagement where theological differences create whole new denominations. We're going to start a brand new denomination because we don't agree with the other theologies. And the church adoption is an expansion where we've got all these dying churches. Jim, would you come in and help us start satellites, our new campuses? And there's all kinds of people who the campus acquiring buildings. And there's also church planting, but they almost all come out of a dead end, and there's really no movement in this process. So this is, we've all had experiences with this gathered church and with these this kind of expansion, but it's been a negative expansion. So hopefully you guys got your notes. If not, we can send those over to you. But as we think about this model, just would love to see what's been your experience. And this is probably one of the reasons why you're in this community, is because you've had some experience with the legacy church, the place for my family, the spread the brand, that kind of thing. Thoughts on that? What's, just share some of your experiences. You guys have had some of these this tension that you guys have had as well. It's probably one of the reasons why you guys are here. So as you think about this, the gathered church and the scattered church are both essential to start and create a movement. But here's the thing: is all of us have a bit of a confirmation bias toward the gathered or the scattered church. And so what's our confirmation bias that we have in the gathered and scattered church? We all have some sort of a confirmation bias in that we prefer one or the other, but there's a need for both, because if you don't get both moving together, what happens is you really wind up with the unfocused process where the gathered church comes together, and they and the way this diagram works is you hit this what we call the chaotic soup. And the chaotic soup has some of these great qualities in it that are really what we really want. We really want maturity, obedience, all these qualities, these kingdom, community, all these elements. But think of it, I say, almost like a water slide. So you hit this water slide, and when you hit this water slide, think of this as a warming pool. And when you're in the warming pool, the motion of the water is going in this direction. You kind of get yourself up, you kind of clear the water out of your face, and then you hit down this part of the slide. So think about the New Testament church. So they moved from Jerusalem into Antioch because they were scattered because of persecution. So they built this church in Antioch, which was a brand new church, and they built it with what we would call the chaotic soup. And then they prayed together, what should we do? Well, we need to be sending out missionaries. So they put people down this water slide. So they sent out Paul and Barnabas. And this, and we, in our training, we talk about this is centripetal force, motion that moves inward. And this is centrifugal force. And what happens is we've always taught that you can't go both directions at the same time. And you can't. No, one person can't go two opposite directions, but the church can be moving inward. But if they move inward, they need to have prayer, training, and a funding lab for kingdom expansion as one of their. What if we had a gathered church that these were their qualities? And so what we're saying is we almost have to have a different kind of gathered church that doesn't have this negative of rigidity and legalism, but actually has these qualities, these chaotic soup qualities. And then what if we had a scattered church that was centrifugal, that was outwardly focused with the apostle? the prophet, and the evangelist. Those are the three ones. But if you have a scattered church that doesn't have a healthy balance, the apostle has low accountability. How many times have you seen in a church plant culture where the apostle is not accountable and they kind of get off and they get in the weeds sometimes, or the prophet becomes radical, they start saying extreme radical things, or the evangelist is arrogant and prideful? The benefits are freedom, flexibility, mission, life change. The negatives are isolation and being unfocused. The benefits are it's rapid kingdom expansion. So they sent Paul and Barnabas out, but then it wasn't long before in Acts 15 they had to come back in to the church, and they came together in the chaotic soup. They had a conversation. They were sent back out again. Then Acts 22, they come back in. They hit the warming pool, this beautiful chaotic soup, and they recover. They come in from the cold. They warm up. They get a good meal. They get strengthened. They encourage the brothers and sisters, and so the shepherds, teachers, and prophets all come into, and they're engaging in their mission because they're in this soup. Then the apostles, prophets, and evangelists go back out again, and we see this rhythm that was happening in the New Testament church. And so the idea is, what if we built something like that? What if we did that? So, Kevin, if you would, when you and I were talking, kind of coming up with this, you shared some ideas that were really kind of critical ideas of you have come in from the scattered side of things.
Right.
And you saw the need for the gathering. In fact, you're starting your gathering there. So I'd love for you to share some of what you've reflected on.
Yeah, just a quick history. I was part of 3 church plants, which is a scattered function in the late 90s, early 2000s, and then took a position in a stable, which is a key to stability, is one of the keys to the gathered church. In 2003, worked there for 3 or 4 years, and my apostolic side just couldn't do it any longer. And I valued the stability. I had a really great paycheck and a good retirement and those things. So I really highly valued those. So there's a lot of tension in letting some of that stability go and step out into a gathered movement. But we did it, much to my wife's dismay. Dismay, is that how you say that? Dismay. But she was willing to follow, and we had a really awesome experience over the next 4 or 5 years building a disciple making network that was 100%. Well, I'd say it was 90% decentralized. So we came right out of a highly centralized environment into a completely decentralized environment. And the moment when that happened was we had been in a staff meeting for about an hour and a half trying to come up with a strategy to keep the biggest giver happy. And I was just like, man, if all I can do is spend my life trying to make 1 or 2 people happy to keep the doors open, I'm going to be lying on my deathbed, looking back on a miserable life. So I just, it was a highly centralized, highly ordered in church environment. So I thought, well, the answer is let's just get out of the church. Let's have no form of Sunday corporate gathering. Not a lot of structure. Keep it as decentralized and organic as possible. And we did that really well for about 4 years. And we probably got up to a couple hundred people meeting in little smaller groups of 10 to 12, or a little more or a little less, doing really great things and seeing people come to know Jesus. But at some point, it completely imploded upon itself and disappeared really quickly. And so some of these principles just were real life for me at the time. As Dan mentioned, the gathered church provides sustainability for a movement, but if it's not partnered with a scattered church, it eventually just becomes the 200-year-old church on the corner with 7 white-haired people waiting to die. But if you go the opposite extreme and go completely decentralized with no partnership with the gathering, then some really great multiplication happens, and it's like poof, something explodes, it's great, and then it's gone the next day. So I kind of spent a decade as a business owner and thinking about those things and kind of getting my feet back under me. And just about a year ago, started a movement here in Middle Tennessee, and really great, energetic, decentralized, organic disciple making happening. Some like really good addition, just kind of starting to look like a little multiplication. But now I'm like, I don't want to make that same mistake again. So I'm just in the tension right now of trying to figure out what structure, what centralization, what organization is necessary to provide sustainability. So I'm probably coming from the opposite angle of most of you guys, where you've got a Sunday gathering trying to figure out how to get them outside of the four walls and multiply. And we have people that are multiplying pretty quickly, trying to figure out how to partner with the shepherds and teachers so that it doesn't just fall apart. So that's
So
kind of my personal story.
good. And so
Yeah.
Kevin sees the need for the gathered church because he's been in the scattered and been out there and blown out. And now he's thinking, how can I do this? I just want to look for us to brainstorm a little bit. And the reason why I've asked Carlene to share a little bit here today too is because she has been in this gathered church environment, and there's this beautiful thing that's happening in the church that she's in. Is they've done this gathered church, and they've been like many of us trying to do with how do we do this scattered church. And so sometimes we start X groups and we get on this part of scattered, and it kind of comes back in here. And so they scatter up and they come back up here. So we don't have the problem that Kevin had. Kevin had the problem of being out there and going, okay, I'm not sure where to go out here. What do we do? And being afraid almost to start the gathering. Carlene is like a lot of us, and I'd love for Jim even to jump in here too, is that we've gotten some of this movement going to accelerate. But the challenge that we've got is we keep maybe sometimes coming back into this place. How do we do this where this begins to define this? Think of the New Testament church. When they gathered for the mission of sending. They gathered for the process of being a prayer training lab, funding lab for kingdom expansion, letting these guys with their gifts move forward in this way. So Carlene is connected to a high apostle, and the apostle was taken out for the season by a car wreck. And so she's had to step forward, and we're kind of brainstorming with her, what would it look like for Epic Church to be in this place where they're experiencing this is actually being transformed. And it's not by any grand design, it's because they've lost their apostle. And so Carlene she has more shepherding, more teacher, more of these kind of qualities here. And a whole group of people are stepping up. And Carlene, would you care to kind of talk about the chaotic soup that you guys are starting to experience as you're watching this thing kind of unintentionally happen? Now, the key is it is intentional, in that Jeremy launched this culture 8 years ago, and he kept struggling with this rocking back and forth here and didn't get the kind of process here. So now this gathering is being changed by this movement. Carlene, just share, just real briefly, kind of what you guys are seeing.
Yeah, so I would say there's a couple of things that have played into it. Similar to what Dan shared, we started in that gathered state several years ago, and Jeremy is a high apostle, incredible leader, passionate, driven, and for years we've been trying to figure out how do we move people towards this scattered. And so there were a few people that got it, and they started to practice it, and we saw some traction with that, but we still had the Sunday morning, and we still had the piece of the anthill and the gathered church that people would in some ways revert back to what felt comfortable. And so a few got traction, some would start to get traction, but then they would come back into the gathered and want to really stay in the gathered side of things. And so I would say there were two catalysts that have started to propel us, and we're in the messy middle where we have definitely not figured it out yet, but we have started to see both happening. First was obviously COVID, with the building being shut down and the large gathering no longer being able to happen. Individuals that we had been pouring into for years started to realize the benefit of the scattered. And so we started to see multiplication into neighborhoods, into homes, really into multiple different regions in this area, not just close by. And so that started to take traction out of necessity. But then the second piece, as Dan mentioned, Jeremy was in a car accident in August, so a couple months ago. And with him being completely out of the picture for several months, I would say that was the next catalyst that not just allowed individuals that had thought about stepping up to really step into roles of saying, wow, okay, when that person is gone, what happens? How do we continue to move the mission and the vision forward? And so that was the other piece that we saw that really catalyzed moving towards a scattered, and individuals realizing we really can take ownership of moving into neighborhoods and in having people to our homes and really starting discipleship that we've been poured into. We just hadn't taken it to the next step. And so now that we've opened back up, obviously, and Jeremy is definitely healing, and we're so grateful for that. As I mentioned before, I would say we're living in that messy middle where some individuals are still attracted to and more comfortable with the gathered. And so we see the value of that side. But then there's another whole section of people that have experienced the life-giving expansion, multiplication of the scattered. And so they're all for the scattered side of things. So it feels like our church has become kind of two very different groups of people. And so we're learning how to function in the middle, which obviously that brings tension to us as staff of how do we really empower both groups to live to their fullest potential, because they need each other. And so that's kind of where we're at right now in our story.
Thank you, Carlene. I appreciate that. So we're going to put you guys into groups here in a minute. And I want us to kind of brainstorm, because in many ways, Carlene's story is where we need you to start thinking, what would it look like? And I use this illustration of when I left California. I left, and they actually advanced a lot further with me being gone. What would it look like if you, the apostle, or the apostle in your church was gone? And maybe your church isn't led. Maybe maybe that's not your core gift. But if the apostolic leader was gone, what would it look like? And when I left, we've been trying so hard to build a multiplication culture, and we had done a good job over 17 years. When I left, they launched 16 churches the first 2 years I was gone. They launched more than I did the whole time I was there. And they launched a whole movement of like 30 multiplication communities out from that. And it's like, I had my feelings hurt a little bit at first, like, well, that sucks. Why are they doing so much better without me? It's because by me being removed, we were able to actually see this emerged. I think we have to learn what would it look like for this to be a different kind of gathered community. This is going to take some changing, and sometimes the apostolic leader can be a hindrance to that. But this apostolic leader is still essential for this and essential for this. They're absolutely essential. But how does this work? And because we really long for this is messy middle, but it's also the chaotic soup. And so we've got several breakout questions. Why are both gathered and scattered essential to create a movement? And when I say confirmation bias, it's like, which do you tend to lean toward, and why have you led the way you've led? And then both need to be reformed. How would a chaotic movement naturally reform the other one? The gathered to the scattered, or the scattered to the gathered. And then the whole revitalization movement, this is the revitalization movement. And I guess almost the answer what's missing in the revitalization movement is the scattered. So maybe you don't need to discuss the third question much, but jump in, take about 10 minutes and discuss this in your breakout groups. So Tyler, put us in our groups, and we'll come back and reconvene. As you guys were we just kind of wanted to get this discussion started so we could begin thinking through this. So what would it look like? I just want us to kind of dream a little bit, and I'd love for Jim Richmond to jump in and maybe dream a little bit with us, because a lot of you guys actually are wrestling with this very thing. What does it look like for this to happen? What would it look like for us to change and reform the gathered church, so that instead of just having a Sunday morning service here, because this is the Trojan elephant tribe, right? And so all of you guys have launched a scattered movement, and maybe you're not happy that your scattered movement hasn't gotten out there to the outer ends of the earth, but maybe it's just kind of gone here and rocked back and forth, and maybe you're even content with it kind of being in the, it gives a place for your apostles, prophets, evangelists to not be so disruptive, and it gives your shepherds, teachers a place that, we'll do the Sunday morning service and we'll just let these people just kind of do their own thing and keep paying the bills, but we're not getting very far out here. What would it look like, Jim, for the church? If you dreamt about this, maybe even Josh, some of the rest of you guys, if you dreamt about what would it look like for the gathered church to actually be creating this, so it would change the nature of the gathered church? thoughts on that, Jim, or other guys? Just let's dream and brainstorm. What would that look like? Any thoughts on that?
I mean, I was just telling the group we were in, Dan, that that top half has been something that obviously has been a shift for us for a long time, and emphasizing that, pushing that. I don't know that I know what it looks like right now for the bottom half to be more, I guess, restructured for the top half. I'm not sure. I'm not sure exactly what that looks like. We're constantly just pushing to have people, do a better job of, as far as, scattering and that kind of thing. But I don't know. I'm kind of at a loss on that.
Well, you and Josh are both kind of dreaming about that. Josh, I know you're kind of dreaming about that. That's been kind of one of your just thoughts on that, Josh, as you're looking at what would it look like for the gathered church to be that way. Any quick thoughts on that?
Yeah, I have a lot of theories and ideas in my head. They're preferred values, not practiced yet, so we're trying to get there. But I know one thing that I think would definitely help that, we kind of set it as a goal for our church at the beginning of the year, and it's been slower moving than I would like, but we wanted to start using the gathered space to specifically celebrate what's happening in the scattered space. So, so we have what we call scattered together groups. So it's kind of our version of micro churches, I guess. And so I had this goal. My goal was every Sunday, I want to be highlighting something from one of our ST groups. Well, it's turned into being more about once a month. Part of that, the struggle though, is, and my apostolic side, I won't be telling stories every week, but in reality, it's just taken a while for our group leaders to even understand what can be shared. I think a lot of times they're looking for like the big grand moment where there's something awesome happened, and that's the only thing worth sharing, where I'm trying to get them to say like, hey, just the little nuances of the Holy Spirit that your group's paying attention to, like that's worth sharing. And so before we can get to where we're sharing more stories in the gathered space about what's happening in the scattered space, I'm just finding we're having to back up and say, okay, these are wins. Like these are things that are worth celebrating. So it's like every time we get an idea of what it could look like, I'm realizing there's about 4 or 5 steps we're gonna have to back up on and reteach or relearn or detox or something before we can even see that one become a reality. So yeah, so we're kind of working through it, but that was one of the first things that came to my mind.
Good, thanks, Josh. Well, as we think about this, I think it's going to change, Josh, how you guys are trying to take some steps in this. Instead of doing as much of an attractional approach, having more conversations, having more of your actual stage and platform time about really what's going on here. And that's a shift you guys are trying to make. So it's actually changing how you do everything that you do here. And you'll lose some people. There'll be some people who won't want to do this. But that actually becomes defining. You define yourself somewhat by who you're willing to lose, right?
Well, and I would say we have lost a few people this year, and not because of COVID, but because we have one guy who's one of our most consistent, bigger givers, who said, he was a part of the growth before I got here, and he said, I just kind of see where the church is going, and I really thought we were going to like be working toward getting a more traditional church building, and it doesn't seem like we're going that direction. So I was like, well, you're right, that's not where we're headed. So don't let the door hit you on the way out, kind of. No, I didn't say that, but it was one of those conversations, and you're right. We will lose people because the less we focus about a traditional gathering, it's just not going to resonate with everybody.
So
Hey,
what
Dan,
would
can I jump in real quick? I think it might be helpful for gathered people to hear from scattered people, and I'm a scattered people. Because I go to a Sunday church for my family, for my kids to have some stability, and my wife is a more, she's not a scattered person so much. And so like, I don't really connect with them on the scatter side at all. So I met with one of the pastors of that church yesterday, and just told him what we were doing with this. We were really starting to see a little bit of multiplication and just excitement, and the questions I'm having about how do we integrate a little bit of gathered without it getting out of hand. And I thought, well, maybe there's some way for us to partner with them. And basically, and it's not critical, they just don't know how to deal with people like me, right? So the basic response is like, oh, I think there might be some way there we can work together, but it's going to have to fit into our structure. And that is the gathered church thing to say. That is the shepherd teacher thing to say. And like from a scattered person, that feels like someone saying, we appreciate what you're doing, go do it, but we don't have any system to support you. So like a scattered person, and it might be that your people that are sitting in the pews may not be who's going to essentially be your scattered people in the end. Maybe you have to pull them or recruit them from the outside and offer them a safe place to be nurtured, supported. But what you also probably need to do is say, you may not fit into the system that we have, but we understand that you're apostolic, you're evangelistic, and we want to support, embrace you, be here for you, and actually send you out to do what God calls you to do. So apostolic evangelists tend to choose to be isolated from everyone else because no one really understands them in the gathered church. So they might find other apostle evangelists, but most likely they're just going to try to isolate themselves and do their thing. And then what that leads to is a moral implosion or burnout or something like that. So I would recommend the gathered church just embracing apostles, evangelists, trying to understand them, even if you can't, and trying to create a space for them in your gathered scenario. Is that helpful?
That's really good, Kevin, I think. And I think that we have to also be aware of some of the indicators that happen, and maybe even use this kind of an image to help your gathered people understand we're not here to maintain legacy. We're not here to have a place for a family or care for our own or become larger or spread the brand. Those will be some of the byproducts of happening when we get this chaotic soup happening. You can't help but have some of those things. Communitas is a community that actually is on mission. All these things, restoration, structure, all these things will actually restore your soul, renew you, do the things that you need to do, because shepherds, teachers, prophets, they're wonderful, restore giving, life-giving type people. But we need both of these movements at the same time. Any thoughts on that?
Dan, I have a thought. One of the defining questions for us has been, how does the gathered church need to worship for the scattered? So instead of being like asking ourselves, how are we a seeker church? How do we worship for seekers? We've been asking, how do we worship for disciple makers? How do we worship for the scattered? So they have the depth, they have the worship, they have the teaching that they need. So when they gather, they leave having received the content that they need, the encouragement they need. And so, like we've mentioned, that meant that some of the folks we've lost over the years didn't stay with us and didn't join us. But it has allowed the scattered to give such definition and life to what we do as the gathered. It's been really profound for us.
That's good. Well, I love even what Kevin, thank you, Storm. I love what Kevin said. Would you kind of jump into that a little bit more, Kevin? Because you said in the chat, you never thought of taking your family to a gathered system for their good. Just talk about that, Kevin, if you could.
Yeah, I'll just say thank you to Kevin Beasley. A couple thoughts. First of all, I'm surprised they didn't try to hire you, that gathered church, because you could maybe, if you're good enough, be our small groups pastor. Let's talk about that. But anyway, I love that thought that you said. Just in my own selfishness, I've never really thought about that. Like, maybe Esther and the kids would really be blessed to just be a part of a gathered system that encourages them and provides them fellowship. And here I am thinking of embracing the chaos, and they've embraced the chaos because they're with me, but probably to their preference is not to have as much chaos as I prefer. And so I appreciate that thought, Kevin, that, hey, that's okay. We're in this season where maybe our wives or our spouses and our kids could prefer that stability for a season. It would be good for them.
Well,
Right. And then if you happen to be in the church Kevin ends up attending, then make sure, make a space for him to be who God's called him to be.
That's good.
Mhm.
Well, and so I think all of our leaders on the call here are providing some good dimensions of that. Thank you for doing that. So you're really trying hard. But Carlene is experiencing something that by Jeremy stepping out, they're starting to see other leaders moving in. And when Jeremy comes back in, this church is not going to be anything like the church he left. Carlene, can you talk about what's happening as you're getting a plurality of leadership and it's happening? Now, Jeremy laid the foundation. I think it's because of Jeremy's leadership this is all happening. So we give credit to Jeremy. Can you talk about kind of what you guys are seeing happening in this messy middle, as you said?
Yeah, I could see that when you say that in 3 specific areas. One with our small group leaders, watching them really step up because they have to. The second, that I saw with our staff team specifically, whereas maybe in the past, and all of them are accelerators. In the past, it would have been, hey, I have this idea for my ministry area. I wonder what Jeremy would think about that. Or, hey, I have this idea. I wonder if that fits in the vision that Jeremy has. And in this season where that wasn't a possibility to have those conversations, as a staff team, it became, hey, I have this idea. Okay, what's the Holy Spirit telling you to do? And so it raised the level of tension for each of our staff members to go and to have these conversations with the Holy Spirit, because it's God's church, not ours. And it gave them the freedom in some ways to try things that maybe they've never tried before. And so we're moving into things that we've never tried, but it's because these staff members have had to pursue the Holy Spirit on what to do in their ministry areas. And the third area that I've seen this is with Jeremy not being able to speak on Sundays, we had to create a teaching team that would rotate, and all of them were accelerators. And so what happened is our church family for months got to hear from individuals who were accelerators. Some are staff, some are not, but individuals where they got to hear the same DNA, but not just from the same person. Each Sunday it was a different person, but they were speaking in the same DNA. That would not have happened if there wasn't that season without Jeremy being able to be present. So yes, it's definitely a messy middle, but we see some really good things that have come from it as well.
Well, and what happens is when the people there start sharing stories of what's going on, you start to hear the Spirit's power, freedom. You start to see these things start to save community, spirit. You see spiritual conversations, and they're describing what's happening in their X groups and their multiplication culture. So instead of just having testimonies, they're literally having week after week sharing, and stories are emerging. And I think in the New Testament church, they shared a lot of stories of life change, which I think is one of the key pieces of actually creating what we're talking about here. Of the prayer, the funding, the lab for expansion is a natural process when you begin to allow that movement, that centripetal movement. There's the beauty of the New Testament church coming together. And so you guys are getting further ahead than most of us because out of necessity and out of need, not by design, because we as apostolics struggle with this thing. What if we can think of all the reasons why this doesn't work, right? We think of all the problems, how this is against our systems, but anyway, but it's just, but I even just this past week saw Tyler and Chris share at their separate campuses and how the people are gathered around them, and just a microcosm just this past week of how, I mean, anyway, just you guys have all been experimenting with this. Storm, you've been experimenting with this. I want to put you guys into breakout groups and just to kind of talk about this. Maybe you just want to discuss this, or maybe you want to hit these breakout questions. What happens when the gathered rejects their mission for this? What happens if we don't do this? What happens when the scattered reject the collaborative mission of the gathered church? Why are these two motions so hard to coordinate together? What's the benefit of the soup? Those are questions. Just jump in and take about 5 or 6 minutes and talk about that, if you would, and we'll come back. Okay. Storming and dreaming about this idea of how this would look. Hopefully you guys had some chance to talk about that So I just want to just wrap up the last second or two. What would it look like for our churches, for these people? This is what we talked about in our group, for the shepherds, teachers, and prophets to find their identification and their mission in creating this chaotic soup, and empowering and working together with the apostolics, the prophets, and the evangelists, being on mission somewhat themselves here, but finding their real purpose in gathering so that scattering happens. That's going to take a work of the Holy Spirit, because in the questions we talked about, these two motions are so hard to coordinate. They're constantly in conflict with each other. And if we're not careful, these guys want to eliminate these guys here. They will work against each other, and the chaotic soup will become a toxic waste pile. And you don't want that. After you've had a nuclear explosion, you've got this waste that is toxic. And how many of us have seen a toxic waste church? And sometimes even the best intentioned prophets or shepherds, the best intentioned apostolic and prophetics and evangelists will destroy the church. And so we've got to let each other help us get to this place. Any final comments before we wrap up in the last minute from your group, or thoughts? Maybe one person just share something you thought was really insightful. Your time together. Well, guys, listen, here's what I want us to do. I want us to be wrestling with this idea. This is a conversation that hopefully you'll take and you'll continue on with. And we're going to talk about this in our breakout cohorts for the next month or so. We'll be back on the simulcast on the first Thursday of June. And we'll pick up these conversations, and I appreciate you guys. Love you guys. We're gonna have our rabbit colony guys come in. You're welcome to hang around and meet some of those guys if you want. But the rabbit tribe will be in. And Tyler, if you could just let them start coming in. We'll start. Any questions you guys have while the rabbit colony guys are coming in? Any thoughts? Any feedback? Someone just share a thought or feedback while the rabbit guys are coming in.